Now, Richard Haydarian is a political analyst and he joins me now from Manila. Now, Richard, what was President Duterte's main message in his speech today?
Well, there wasn't much surprising about his speech. I mean, it was the usual Duterte starting a little bit presidential, then a lot of ad-libs, a lot of going out of script, a lot of jokes, sometimes inappropriate jokes. But he was defiant as always. He said that he never second-guessed any of the major decisions he made. A bulk of his speech was defending his law and order approach. A lot of that was about defending his war on drugs and also providing protection for erring policemen if ever they're going to face accountability once he's out of office. A lot of that also was about his populist attacks on supposed oligarchs and cartels, which is something that really resonates among many Filipinos who may not agree with him on a lot of his policies, but they like the fact that he's going after big business. So I think he was disciplined in terms of sticking to the core messages that he has been making year after year after year. But a lot of us were really watching what will be different because this will be his final State of the Nation address. And we're heading to the next elections. And Duterte has been sending fillers that he may run as a vice president, something unprecedented that could potentially make him again a president. And maybe this is not his final State of the Nation address. And his daughter could be one of the potential top contenders for the office. We didn't hear much about that, interestingly. So I think that was the surprising part because I was expecting him to make a point about why he needs to be in the game. But just to emphasize this point, he also said, being Duterte, this is not his swan song, that he's gonna still stick around. So I think that was also his way of making teasers about the fact that he could still be around political office in one way or another, maybe not the presidency come next year.
Okay, so he's still left a lot open for interpretation. When his term ends, though, what will his popularity ratings be like, do you think?
That's a big question we have been debating for quite some time. In fact, if you look at the surveys, they're beginning to diverge. And some of the online surveys and news surveys are suggesting a different kind of outcome here. I mean, without a question, I think the president has a majority approval rating, which is quite normal in a sense that previous president in the Philippines also had it. But, some of the numbers we're seeing 70, 80, 90%. I mean, the big question we ask is this. To what degree can you expect face-to-face surveys to be credible in a climate of fear? Let's not forget a lot of face-to-face surveys are conducted in poor communities, which, by the way, tend to be also hit by extrajudicial killings. So what is your incentive to be really honest about how you feel about the powers that be when you had all of this violence going around right and left, especially under these circumstances of emergency powers? So I have some doubts about the 70, 80, 90%, but I think it's popular enough heading into the next presidency. But whether that will be sufficient for him to get an anointed successor in office, fair and square, I think that's a very big question. And one of the interesting things he did in his speech was that he was making some indirect attacks against some of the contenders for next year's presidency. And one of them is the mayor of Manila, a youthful, charismatic mayor who came from the slums, a natural populist like himself, who he praised just a year ago, but now he's emerging as the top contender for office next year. And Duterte quite indirectly attacked him in his State of the Nation address. That was something that I think we'll have to pay more attention because we're waiting if the mayor of Manila will also make a response in the coming days. Because just a few weeks ago, Duterte was also in a war mode with another former ally, Manny Pacquiao, right? And Manny Pacquiao, the Filipino boxer and senator, is also eyeing the presidency. So this is the interesting thing we're seeing, that Duterte and former allies and people who used to be on good terms with him are now a little bit in a more competitive mode, if not the Game of Thrones that we're seeing here in the Philippines.
And of course, his term will come to an end amid a pandemic, a crisis which his country is also grappling with. How will his handling of the coronavirus outbreak in the Philippines impact his popularity? How have people thought that he's done so far?
Yeah, as I said, so far the surveys are not showing a significant drop in his numbers. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that, the government provided some basic needs and help. And then there's also the sense of fatalism. And I think it's very much in the political culture. And the president is also very good in hammering that. I mean, his argument was everything was going fine until the pandemic happened. And this is not my fault. Everyone is suffering. And then if you look at infection rates, they're worse in some of our neighboring countries. But, I think it could be vulnerable once we get closer to the elections, whereby contenders, other top contenders can come and say, yes, the pandemic was bad, but a lot of our neighbors handled it better. The Philippines had the deepest recession in the region last year, which extended until the first quarter of this year. And I think that economic immiseration is going to echo for years to come. So there is some ammunition for the opposition and some of his rivals to come in and say, well, the president may have good intentions, but his competence is a big question. And that's what we're going to solve if we become the next president. So he has some vulnerabilities, which are not yet clear now, but could very much come out in the next elections, because we saw exactly the same thing happen in the previous elections in 2016. The late President Aquino was very popular, heading into elections, 50-60% approval rating. But at the 11th hour, Duterte at that point was able to say, hey, you need a competent leader. And he effectively pointed out everything that was going wrong. I think the same thing could happen to him if the contenders learn the right lesson from the 2016 election. So he could be a victim of his own tricks back in 2016 elections.
Well, Richard, as you said, this might not be the end of his political career, but overall, what legacy do you think he will leave as leader of the country, as president?
Well, I think the president has, like many populists, has really raised good questions. I think the president has pointed out the fact that why few families, 40 richest families in the country, are taking home 76% of newly created growth. That's the highest rate of growth concentration, where most offices of the government occupied by few political dynasty, although, of course, many accuse him of coming from political dynasty. I think he was very good in exposing the hypocrisies and the democracy deficit in Philippines' supposedly liberal political landscape. I think he was really good in that. And I think he also tapped into people's deep sense of insecurity, especially among middle classes and newly middle classes Filipinos, right? Because of high rates of crime and drugs and among other things, although maybe not as bad as Duterte put it. I think he raised really good questions. Whether he was able to answer them properly, that's really up for debate. And many would say at best it's a mixed record. But hopefully successors can take those right questions, but provide more mindful answers that are also in accordance to the rule of law. So I think this is a good thing that Duterte may have left us. He raising the good questions and focusing his successors on the issues that were not really raised or addressed by his predecessors.
Richard Heydarian, always good to talk. Thank you so much.
Pleasure as always.